All right, thanks for tuning in to another edition of WaveLab Workflows. I'm Justin Perkins, and this month I have a special guest, Ian Stewart from the Boston area. He's a fellow mastering engineer, WaveLab user, and all-around smart guy. So I wanted to have him on this month because we're going to talk about the batch processor in WaveLab, and I'm going to be honest that the batch processor is not something I use a whole lot in my workflow for various reasons, which we'll talk about. But I thought it'd be great to have Ian on because Ian has already made a couple videos about the batch processor that you can find on YouTube. He just made those on his own just because he's a nice guy. And I thought, well, who better to have on than Ian to talk about the batch processor. So we're going to get into it pretty quickly, but first I just wanted Ian to, if there's anything else you want to add to that, or if you wanted to talk about, how long you've been using WaveLab and what prompted you to move over to WaveLab from whatever else you were using.
Yeah, totally. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you here. Um, I've been using WaveLab for, I want to say probably a year and a half, maybe a little bit more, and was really prompted to look at it by a lot of the stuff that I saw you talking about, online on Facebook and stuff about it. And so previously I would use OneDoff for all my processing, analog capture, all of that. Then I'd use another program for sample rate conversion and dithering. Then I'd use another program for all the metadata management. And then finally, a fourth program to do all my assembly and final parts creation. And it was a lot of jumping between different things. And, they could all do something that the other couldn't, do as well or as easily. So, hearing you talk about WaveLab and how it had streamlined a lot of your workflow, I thought, yeah, this seems like something I should try out. So, yeah, I think it was about a year and a half ago, I kind of took the plunge and gave it a try and really haven't looked back.
Right, yeah. Sometimes WaveLab, especially people transitioning from production and mixing, they really don't know why they need WaveLab until they do. They're like, oh, I need to do this thing, and my mixing DAW can't do it. I mean, that's kind of why WaveLab exists. I mean, it's kind of a niche piece of software, but as I mentioned, I've tried to, you know, I've looked at everywhere, and WaveLab, I just keep coming back to it as the best. And especially if you want to work on Mac, it's really the only professional option out there for mastering. But it comes down to what do we define mastering as? Some people think of mastering as just the stereo processing. I
Right.
argue that there's more to it, and that's where WaveLab comes in because it does all the assembly of EPs and albums and even singles. So I've covered a lot of that in my previous videos, but what I haven't talked about, like I mentioned, is the batch processor.
Yeah.
Just because, for reasons we'll talk about, I just haven't had a need to use it. I can see why it would be really useful for people doing sample libraries, production music of some kind, even broadcast, and even podcast production, where you're creating content and it has to sound good, but then maybe you want to conform to a certain level and travel through some certain processors, every time once you've gotten it to a certain point. And that's where the batch processor can come in handy because it can save you time. It can also promote accuracy because you know that every time you complete a set of files that now it's going to go through this chain and it's saved as a preset or a setting. And if you are producing a podcast or something that needs to have some consistency, week to week, month to month, that's where I think where the batch processor can come in handy, and just save you time as well. So we'll talk about the batch processor and watch folders, which we talked about a little bit beforehand. Watch folders are basically an automatic folder that watches for new files, and then it can apply batch processor settings when those files arrive. And then can you have it go to a certain output folder?
Yeah, so you can either set up like with a watch folder. I think you can either set up an explicit output folder that you want to and have it kind of recreate like a directory, or you can just have it go to a subfolder within your watch folder.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, I think that's one reason I haven't dug into watch folders is A, I don't really need them, and two, I feel like you still have to move the files somewhere. There's a little bit, it's not totally automatic, but it's a cool feature that we'll talk about. But is
Yeah,
there,
and there are some good use cases too. We can get into a little bit, but like if you have, like if you use file requests from Dropbox or something like that, where all your client mixes always come into that same folder, you could set that up as a watch folder and get a lot of your initial, whether it's resampling to 96K or setting a specific level or whatever. You just have that always happen in the background when the files come in, and then they're still there waiting for you. But
great.
yeah,
Yeah. Let's talk about that too then. So if there's nothing else you want to cover, maybe you can share your screen with us and just show us some examples. You talked about upsampling. It's somewhat controversial or, political as far as do you upsample before you start processing? I'm a fan of it. It's worked for me for many years. Of course, upsampling doesn't improve the quality, but I do believe in working in a high resolution environment, whether you're using analog gear or digital. It can be beneficial, at least to get rid of some aliasing that move it to the inaudible range. But let's just talk about some things that you use the batch processor for. And let's not forget about, our final files. Like you like to render your master in the fullest resolution. So whatever the native sample rate is, and then to floating point rather than 24-bit or 16. And we could talk about why you do that and then how from that master file you can generate all the derivatives, whether it's 16-bit 44.1, MP3, and all that stuff.
And maybe that's even a good place to start, is just to kind of show everyone an example of how I'm using the batch processor. And then we can kind of step through how you could create your own.
Okay.
So I actually created this one last night as I was playing around with stuff, so we can come back to that. But these two are, I'll just make this full screen here. These two are the two that I use kind of all the time. So I have one that creates all my 44.1K production masters and one that will do high res production masters. So my process is I render out of the montage, my final montage for a project. I'll render at whatever the sample rate I got for that project was. If it came in at mixed sample rates, say most of them were 48K, but one was 88.2, I'll upsample everything to 88.2 before I start so that everything at least matches. But then when I'm done, I'll render out at whatever that native sample rate was and at 32 float. And that provides me what I call an archival master, right? So that's kind of like the highest res version of that project. And I just keep that for myself as future proofing. So if the client comes back to me down the road, I don't know, some new format comes out, they want to, port it to that format. I can either create that for them or give them the archival version or whatever. And then I take those and I just drop them into these batch processors. So this first one resamples to 44.1. If it's already at 44.1, it just basically ignores that first resampler. It applies, I've got limiter, TDR limiter 6 just in the true peak mode. So a lot of times resampling can cause overshoot, like peak overshoot, right? So if there's any overshoot, I've just got this set to negative 0.3. So
and can we stop and talk about that?
Yeah.
You're setting it to minus 0.3. I assume because that's what, when you were mastering, that's what your limiter ceiling was set to.
Not necessarily, actually.
Okay.
A lot of times, I might be delivering, if it's for Apple Digital Masters or what have you, I might be at -1.
Okay.
And a lot of times I'll separate sample peak limiting and true peak limiting. So I'll set the sample peak to -1 and then true peak to -0.7, just to make it a little less obvious.
Yeah, I'm with you. So you're always at least underneath you're lower than this 0.3.
Right, exactly. And so this is really like a final safety. So if you get like some really substantial overshoot during, resampling down to 44.1, it's just going to provide that final little bit of safety ceiling headroom.
Yeah, I'm with you. It seems like some people are somewhat surprised when they resample files at the peak levels change. Someone that's maybe newer to mastering and hasn't either done it or analyzed it so closely. But yeah, resampling certainly does change the peak levels by, a fraction of a decibel. It depends on the content and how loud it's been pushed and a whole number of things. But
yeah,
a safety limiter, I do the exact same thing.
Right. So I've got that in there, and then finally I just dither down to 16 bits.
Okay.
So that's the actual processing part of it. And then I've got it. It goes into a subfolder of wherever it comes from. So I rendered these into, like a masters folder in the project directory, and then it puts them in a subfolder. And then really where this gets cool is the file format. You can have a multi-format render. So this will create 1644 waves, 320K MP3s, and the iTunes Plus, Apple Plus 256K AACs. It puts them all in their own subfolder, which you can name here, and then puts a suffix on the end of the name of each file so that, when you're looking at all these files, if they ended up somehow in the same folder, eventually, you could still tell them all apart. So I've got that one that creates all my 44.1K production masters, and then the high res one basically just takes my archival and dithers it down to 24-bit, and that's kind of it. Does a similar thing where it renames the output, so it just says 24XX at the end, and then there's probably a smart way to get it to put the sample rate in. I haven't explored that yet. I created this.
There's a lot of naming scheme options, and let's talk about this one a little bit too, because another somewhat confusing thing I see online is people always say, they're mixing in 24-bit or they're mastering in 24-bit, but what they don't realize is any digital processing is going to increase the bit depth to either 32 or 64-bit float, depending on the DAW. In fact,
Right.
WaveLab lets you choose your precision. If you want to stay at 32, you can, but now it offers 64.
64, yeah.
So the reason you're doing this, just and I know that you know this, but all the processing that you've done in the montage, even if you started with 24-bit or in some cases 16-bit files, if that's what you were provided, the bit depth doesn't stay at that number. It always increases, even the tiniest little gain change. And WaveLab has a bit depth meter, which is very handy just to kind of prove that fact. If you loaded in a 24-bit file to the montage and just, again, obviously plugins and applying changes, or even just the tiniest little gain change, it's going to increase that bit depth. And I think what Ian is saying is, you always want to preserve a fully, an undithered floating point master that you can come back to. I just had a case today where last year I mastered a project, and now a European label wants to put it out, but with bonus tracks. And what's cool is I'm not stuck with the 24-bit or 16-bit versions to cobble it together. I can go back to the full montage, but even still, it's always good to keep a high resolution archive, because you just never know when things need to be reworked. Especially a lot of bands and artists are doing singles and more singles and more singles. Then one day they say, hey, can we make an album out of all these singles? And then we have 2 more new songs, and then preserving it in the highest, resolution just is going to save you some headache and make your work sound better in the end too. So that's another reason to do that.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of people, like you were saying, they're saying, oh, I'm mixing and at 24-bit or mastering at 24-bit. But yeah, really the only 2 parts of the process that happen at 24-bit is the initial recording, right? When you record something in and it comes through your A to D, that's 24-bit. And when you create that final production file, that could be 24-bit, it could be 16. But pretty much everywhere in between, every DAW that I know of these days works at floating point, either 32-bit or 64-bit float.
And I think the reason people get confused is, at least, I came up using Pro Tools, and I don't know if Cubase is like this and the others, but when you start a session, it says, what bit depth do you want to use? And especially back when I started, there was no 32-bit float. So
right,
you choose 24-bit, of course, and then you think you're mixing in 24-bit, but really you're not. And again, WaveLab has a bit depth meter. There's a couple of bit depth meter plugins you can use if you're in another DAW, but it's just handy to know where you're at, and that kind of informs you if and when you need to dither. So that's a nice touch. So you're using the batch processor to just kind of output all your various formats, and people are probably wondering, why you need MP3. I think clients still like to have MP3 versions, even though they don't get used for distribution. They do get used for download codes. If you have a vinyl release and you want to put a download code, oftentimes those are MP3 files. And those types of services, they just host the files you give them. It's not like a digital distributor where you're uploading a wave and then they send it to all the streaming services. They do their thing. The
Right.
download card services, they just host what you give them. It could be anything, really. It doesn't have to be music files, although hopefully it's music files. But I think there's value in, providing your clients with those MP3 files should they want to use them. Because for me, I would rather create them and provide them than leave them up to their own devices and potentially mangle the audio, or not do the metadata. And I was going to ask you, does the metadata carry over when you
Yeah. So
do the batch processor?
yeah, there are a couple ways you can handle it. Actually, so I'm not going to say the default, and we can look at this when we kind of step through creating one. But one option is to just kind of ignore metadata, and basically
Okay.
that just leaves the metadata completely intact. So whatever
Okay.
comes in, it just spits out. There are also some really powerful ways to either merge or replace metadata. So, for example, I mean, one use case might be that you have a whole bunch of files where, whether it's a sound library or whatever, there's metadata in there and it all needs to get updated. So like, you've got 2000 files and they want to update all the metadata, your client wants to update all the metadata to say, have a new date or a new version or whatever, new telephone number and, a comment field, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And you can have it go through and just replace metadata automatically on all those files. So yeah, there's some sophisticated ways to use that. I mean, there are ways that get so deep with using XML and stuff that I really haven't dived into yet.
Yeah,
I suspect if people are watching this, they're more looking to get, just kind of off the ground and running. So
yeah, but
maybe
the nice
someday.
thing is you can enter the metadata once and then it carries over to every format, because I also see on the forums people stressing out over metadata, whether
Yeah.
they even need to add it, or if they do need to add it, how do they do it? And it can be tedious. But again, part of the reason I use WaveLab period is because aside from all the great audio processing and all that good stuff, all I have to do is enter the project info one time. And so much of that can be automatically populated, from, if your files are correctly named to start with, that's going to be the marker name and that can be the CD text name in one click. Then basically all your formats downstream are flush with metadata, and you just don't even have to really worry about it. Obviously, you have to check it and make sure it's accurate, but you're not having to manually create metadata for each format, because that
Each
does get
format.
tedious,
Yeah.
especially like a busy mastering studio where you're doing a record a day or a couple EPs a day and a lot of singles. I mean, this is where WaveLab saves you time. It's just kind of automating and making it simple, all those steps.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think you and I do, handle the metadata thing very similarly. We kind of fill it all out. That's one of the first things I do in a project, actually. I load the files in, I fill out all the metadata fields, and then
Yeah.
I kind of done thinking about it.
And I really don't start on a project till I have information, because to me that's, obviously people hire us for the audio work mostly, but you want it to look good, and you never know what people are using it for. If they're making CDs, the CD text needs to be accurate. If
Yep,
I'm
exactly.
just, my method is just get it right in from the start, and then it makes your life easier. You're not getting a phone call or email a month later to say, oh,
No.
we never gave you the real titles, these were just working titles. That's a waste of everybody's time.
Yeah.
So anyway, so yeah, that's cool that the metadata transfers over, and
Yep.
as Ian mentioned, you can use it just as you could just basically use it as a batch processor for metadata if you do need to if you need to update a bunch of files. I master a lot of library production music as well, and metadata is huge in that world, because that's how the music supervisors know what the song is and who the publisher is, and how to contact. If they want to use a song, the contact information is in the metadata. So when people are talking about metadata and saying it's not important, they may be talking about maybe from a digital distribution standpoint. If you're going to put it on Spotify, it's less important because the distributors don't read that information anyways, and you have to manually enter it. But there's so many other reasons and ways that people are going to read it today, and then who knows about tomorrow. So I think, yeah, just put it in there. But I don't want to focus on metadata too much, but
Yeah.
it's cool that it's there. I know the batch processor can also do file renaming. There's a WaveLab user named Dave4, who maybe you know, Dave. He was asking me this, and I had to figure it out because I had never done it. But you can use the batch processor just to rename files too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And there are a couple ways that it can be done. I don't know if we want to kind of jump into maybe starting from scratch, setting one up, and we can
Yeah,
kinda,
let's start from scratch because I want to see where do we actually input the files because as I said, I really just haven't had a need to use the batch processor.
Sure.
And I didn't want to pretend that I knew how to do it. And I know you're very knowledgeable about it. So let's pretend we're making a new one. Where do we input the files and what are the important windows to look at so we know what's coming in, what's going out, and what's happening in between?
Totally. So I'm just going to go and say create empty, right? So I'm just in the file tab, new batch processor. I'm going to say create empty. There are kind of some templates in here, but it's easy enough to start with an empty one. So, and let me just make this full screen so we can see everything a little easier. So basically there are a couple ways to get files into it. You can either select a folder here. Like once you have it all set up, you can select a folder here, say include subfolders, tell it, you only want to do waves or OGG or MP3 or all audio files, whatever it may be.
Okay.
Or the way I usually end up using it, well, now I've got to make this small again, is I'll go to my file browser and I'll, just go into mastering. This is, I think I'm not connected to Dropbox, so a lot of this isn't going to show up. Anyway, I would just go to my folder here, find the files that the archival master files that I just rendered out and just drag them in. And there are ways that you can set it up so that it will automatically start doing its batch processing when you drop a file or folder in.
Do you have some files you can drop in there for us that aren't going to disclose anything?
Let's I think I have some for a project that I'm just doing for a buddy kind of free time, so I don't think he'll mind. But let's set a few things up first, right? So let's imagine we've talked about resampling, right? So maybe we do that. That's a pretty simple one to set up. So say you want to set up a batch processor that just resamples all your incoming files up to 96K.
And I don't want to, last time I interrupt, but I love your comment about sometimes when you get a mastering project, they're mixed sample rates. And I think the best practice is to upsample them all to a common one. So if you have 3 files that came in at 96 and 4 that came in at 48 and 1 that came in at 44.1, upsample all the lower ones up to 96 to get everything on the same page, because we don't want to punish the 96K ones just because someone else didn't work that high. So there's no best sample rate. You just want to be smart about what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Provide a level of consistency. Excuse me. So basically, the way the batch processor works is fundamentally you set up a plugin chain that you want it to use. And then there's also all the naming and format options. So I pretty much usually use a custom one, but you can use an associated master section preset. So if you save master section presets per montage and you're working with montages, you can actually just have it automatically do that. You can say no plugin if you're just doing metadata stuff, or renaming, whatever it may be. But we're going to say custom plugin chain. And so you get this plugin menu that pops up, and we can go through some of the different types in a little bit, but let's just kind of look at, just an example. So I'm going to go into tools. I'm just going to use the Steinberg resampler here, pop that in, and then that opens up. There's this little window. I'm going to select 96K, make sure quality is on best. And then that's kind of it as far as the processing goes. And then here we've got our, we start looking at output and format options down in this kind of pane down here.
Okay.
So for me, I usually want to say subfolder of source path, and then I can give it a name that I want. But if you're fine just having it called output, you can say subfolder output, and it just automatically names it that. You could put it right in the source path if you're renaming the files and you don't want a subfolder. You could just have them in the same path. You could say explicit path, so put it in this other folder somewhere else. You can say explicit path plus recreate folder structure. So if you're dropping a whole folder structure in and it's got, a whole bunch of subfolders with different files, it'll recreate that in this new explicit path, yada, yada. So there's a whole bunch of different options, right? You can say no audio output if you're just running a report or managing, XML stuff or whatever. But I'm going to say subfolder of source path. I'm going to call it 96K, right? So
Yep.
Descriptive. And then here, there are a couple ways to do renaming, but the easiest way if you're just doing a single format would be to say rename files. And then I'm just going to come here and edit this. And again, to get there, I just clicked on the little preset guy here and say edit. And we're going to say, create a new renaming option. I'm going to insert specific text, and let's just do underscore 96K. And I'm going to say to put that at the end. So if our file was named, Jeff, the original would be named Jeff. The output would be named Jeff underscore 96K.
Okay.
Cool. So there's that. We say, okay. It's interesting. Actually, I basically did this the exact same as this format that I set up last night. So it's actually picked up the name. It's recognized that it's another naming scheme that I already have, and it's just picked that up.
Gotcha. Well, that's a big part of it. I mean, I find that having a repetitive workflow, I always rename, obviously not the file names, but my folder structures are always the same, so that when I come back to a project 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years, I've been using it for almost 10 years. So when I open an old project, I know exactly what I'm looking at. It's not some weirdly named folder that isn't descriptive. It's like I could do it very easily. I can just look at it and know what it's going to be without having to listen to it. And I wanted to also touch on the option of, renaming or doing something and keeping the folder structure is super important. As I mentioned, I do some mastering work for a library music company, and we had a huge basically 10 years of production work with very specific folder structures. And for reasons I won't get into, we had to convert all the files to a new format for another distribution company. But WaveLab made it super easy to do that and retain the folder structure, so we didn't create a huge mess or have to reorganize. We're talking thousands and thousands of files. So, I wanted to cry when I saw that option, because the previous software I was using didn't do that. It was like, okay, now we'll do one folder, now I'll do another. It required a lot of babysitting. So that's a huge feature for people that are dealing with, intricate folder structures and a lot of files, to be able to convert the files and retain that folder structure. That's going to save you potentially hours or days of work.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there are a lot of little things, I don't even know that we could touch on everything today if I tried, but
Right.
There are a lot of little things like that, really all over WaveLab, but definitely as you work through the batch processor, you'll find all these, really neat little options, multiple ways of doing similar things, depending on how you like to work, what your preference is, your workflow preference. So then the next thing you want to kind of set up is your format, right? So I assume we're going to want a 96K wave. So really by default, you can kind of just say, leave it as wave default. But if you want to get specific, you can. And so, this just allows you, you may have seen this audio file format window, whether it's in, your render settings or whatever. It's very similar, right? So you just pick your extension, your format. We're going to say match input stream for channel. So if you happen to get, a surround or, higher than 2 channel file, it'll just match that. I'm going to go ahead and specifically, explicitly state that the sample rate is 96. And I'm going to, say that the bit depth I wanted to save at 32 float, and you could even put 64 float if you want. Metadata, it's going to inherit from source file. So the way I'm thinking of this is, something that you're going to use for your ingest, so your incoming files. they probably don't have any metadata. You could also say do not save anything. So you could just clear out any metadata if you wanted. Maybe that's preferable. Or you can set up a specific metadata preset for this configuration. So if you wanted to add some metadata on that initial pass, you potentially could. So I'm going to say okay there. The batch metadata, this is where, like, if you wanted to add some metadata or replace a specific thing, you could use merge or replace. Ignore basically just leaves the incoming metadata alone.
Okay.
And then these last few tabs, kind of optional stuff, as implied by options, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. You can have it create peak files, which just makes it rendering of those, waveforms a little faster when you then bring it into WaveLab. So if you know that you're going to be bringing it in, maybe that's a good thing to leave on. You can have it copy any markers. So if your client has included some markers, and that's going to be useful to look at, for whether, they've got verses and choruses and stuff marked, and they can tell you, oh, hey,
or we can know where there used to be a bass guitar mistake that they hopefully fixed.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you can copy markers in. And then this I would use only in specific cases, but I have run into instances where an audio file gets corrupted or something and it doesn't have a valid header. And so, the header contains information on sample rate, channels, all sorts of stuff. So you can have it accept it and let's cancel there, reinterpret the sample rate. And so if you've got a file that you're having a problem with, this is one way, or a whole bunch of files that you have a problem with, this is one way to potentially kind of fix them and recover them.
Yeah, I've had WaveLab save the day. People send me old stuff to remaster from the early days of Pro Tools and digital and DAWs, and there's just nothing will play it. But somehow WaveLab is able to figure it out and let me save it as an actual wave, something that is usable downstream. So WaveLab's great for recovering mystery digital files that seem broken, or maybe they just play static when you try to play them, and because it doesn't know what it is. So also good to know.
Play at the wrong sample rate. I've had this happen a weird number of times where someone will have their recording device set to 48K maybe, and then the DAW somehow gets out of sync and records at 44.1, and then it plays back, at the wrong speed, basically.
Yeah.
Because the computer the header gets written as one thing, but the data is recorded at another rate. And so WaveLab's great for that. And especially like if you ended up with a whole folder full of stuff where this, someone recorded a whole, multi-channel, maybe they've got, 40 channels of instruments they've recorded, drums, keyboards, whatever. Somehow it all got recorded with the wrong sample rate header. You could just quickly build a batch processor that would fix that and just knock it all out very quickly. And then the XML thing, this honestly, I have not gone down this rabbit hole, but there is a whole XML batch processing tab here where you can do some pretty sophisticated stuff.
Yeah, probably useful for people doing, sound libraries, maybe music for games, production library stuff, something where there's a whole lot of files and a whole lot of data that needs, or files that need specific names. So yeah, I myself haven't dug into that, but I could see it just saving hours of time if you, if someone's providing you a spreadsheet of what the final titles need to be, and it's like, because when you get into production music and things like that, it's not just a lot of songs, but it's also like anywhere from 3 to 10 versions of a song, because it's the mix without the lead element. It's a mix without any vocals. It's a mix there's so many variations of each song. So I think this could come in handy.
Stuff for games, you might have, different layers that come in and out depending on what the gameplay is doing, and they each have, their own naming format that they need. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's good that it's there for those that really need it.
And like I was saying, maybe if there's enough interest, I can try and get smart on that, and at some point down the road, we could do a kind of, more detailed, in-depth as if this isn't detailed and in depth for most people, but really nerd out on the specifics of some of those options.
Yeah.
Yeah. So moving along, then the tab on the right here is kind of all about, execution and how the batch processor runs, right? So I like to use auto start when dropping files because that's the way I use it. I open up the batch processors and I drop in my files from my my archival master folder. So you could do that. You can also do it manually and either, add the folder that you want here and then hit run all or start. A few ways to do it, but I really like the auto start with dropping files. I also like to say auto remove converted files. The naming is a little misleading there, maybe. It's not removing the files from your computer, it's just removing them from the processing list that you'll see when we go and drop some files in, show us up here.
Okay.
So basically, once you'll drop files in, so you drop in 10 files, you'll see a list of 10 file names and you'll see them slowly disappear. And once they're all gone, it means, okay, the processing is done and everything is ready to go. So I like to use that because that's an easy way to kind of, if I'm doing something else in the background, I might set this to go and then, catch up on emails on my phone or, whatever. I can glance over and if I see, there's no more files here, I know it's done.
Yeah, it helps keep things clean too. You're not constantly cleaning up stuff that's
right. You don't have to go select them all and then, remove them from the list and yada yada. So there's that. Auto insert files from source folder. So if you drop I'm going to turn this on. If we drop a folder in, it's just going to grab the files from there. So that's kind of nifty.
Okay.
I have it set up usually for my production master creation to stop on error. If there's an error, I want to know about it. I don't want it to keep going, but you can have it keep going and either have a file list or just kind of ignore it in the background. So I don't know. We'll leave that on.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. I can't think of many cases where I would want it off, but I'm sure there are some. And then one of the neat things is that, I use this kind of as part of my daily flow. When I'm done with a project, I just drop it in, but you could set this up to run, we'll get into watch folders, but with watch folders, you could set this to run at specific times. So you can determine how many of your processor cores you want it to use. So I always say all cores, because if I'm batch processing something, I'm not doing something else.
Right.
But, if you want to say all cores but one or all cores but two or half of the cores, whatever it may be, you can do that to make sure that there's always, if you're doing something that is processor intensive, whether you've got a really big plug-in chain with, some linear phase and multiband and whatever, you can make sure that some of your computer resources, get left free for other stuff in the background. So that's kind of neat. And then there's some overwrite options. So, if there, if for some reason a file is getting overwritten, whether you're running a batch processor a second time or something just goes wrong and it's trying to overwrite a file, you've got some options. You can stop and ask, or you can report it as an error. And then if you have stop on error set up, it'll just stop. So that's how I usually do it. I say, it's going to overwrite something, call that an error and stop the whole thing and let me know what's going on. You can auto rename. You can skip it and mark it as done. That to me seems like a risky proposition, but so you've got a whole bunch of options in there. So that's basically how you would set up a batch processor. And then, we might as well go and save this. So this is the one I created last night, but I'm just going to overwrite it. So this just goes in my documents, WaveLab Pro batch processors folder. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to say replace. And then basically, right, so I've got, this is this project I'm working on for one of my friends. Here's all the main mixes, right? So now I should be able, if I've done this right, to just drop that folder in there. It's going to say, add files in this folder. I can say include, there aren't any subfolders in there, I don't believe, but I can say include subfolders if there were. And actually, you know what? Here, let's do one better. Let's go up a level and let's just take all our source files. We'll drop it in here. We'll say include subfolders. It's going to look for waves. We'll say, okay.
I think some of them were AIFs, if I
were
caught
they?
that correctly.
That would do it. I was going to say, and nothing happened. Let's look real quick. Right you are. Okay. Try one more time. We will look for AIF. There we go. All right. So they all popped in. I thought with auto start it would have started, but maybe not when you drop a folder. Oh, you know what? This is why too.
Yeah, I mean, you could set it to all audio file types at the bottom.
Yeah, that's probably best. But let's just go ahead and say start. Okay. So it's going to go through, and you can see it starts to run these, and you can see some of them start disappearing. And if we go in here, eventually, depending on the order that it starts, we should see, I don't know which ones it's starting with. Yeah, okay, so we can see 96K has popped in for some of the acapellas, so it's doing that first, presumably. So it should make a 96K subfolder in each of these,
okay,
and put the resampled versions of those files in there. So there's a whole bunch in here. So yeah, it's going to take a little while to crank through, but we can chat about other stuff. Or I don't know if people have questions in the background while that works.
There is one question, and I wanted to mention, we could also, people think about normalization as the end of the process or streaming services. We could also normalize these all to a common level so that we have a great starting point. Sometimes mixes come in all over the map, and there's no right level, but there is usually a preferred starting point. But one cool thing about the montage is the meta normalizer. So I tend to not change the level, before I start. I like to know the actual level, and we can non-destructively normalize in the montage. So that's, I don't know.
Right, exactly. And I think that's another place where you and I do things very similarly. We use the meta normalizer and have a, good level that we can normalize to that works for our analog chain. And then, you can always tweak it from there to get things dialed in, but it provides a great starting point. But you could absolutely do that here as well. If you did it in the batch processor, it is a destructive process.
Exactly.
Right? Because it's writing it to a new file. But if you're resampling to 96K, and I don't, maybe you're okay with that.
Yeah, and this is where I think people that are producing podcasts or some sort of maybe non-musical content, and the broadcast industry has way more standard. With music, there really is no standard for loudness. It's like all over the place. In broadcast and probably gaming and a lot of the the less creative and less musical parts of audio, they're a lot more standard. So you probably could use the batch processor to say, okay, I've produced my program, my show, but I want to deliver it at minus 23 or minus 16 or minus 18. You could add the meta normalizer in there, and then have your output be always a consistent level. And the cool thing with the WaveLab normalizer is you can have it. There's a number of ways to normalize. There's integrated, which is the whole piece. But what I like to use for starting, especially for a starting point, not necessarily for an ending point, is normalizing, the loudest part of each song or each piece to the same level. That way, like each piece, sort of the loudest moment of each piece feels the same, which is usually how it makes for a great starting point and a great ending point. But, typically the goal of mastering an album is you not the only goal, but one of the goals is you kind of want the biggest parts of each song to be relatively the same. Maybe there's one song that's the loudest, biggest song, but it makes for I think of normalization as more of a starting point than an ending point. I love it for just getting everything on the same page so then I can begin to work without wrestling levels, because then it's already at a point where I like it for starting.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking of like broadcast stuff specifically, I mean, I'm very much on the same page. I use it as a starting point. A lot of times I'm finding I'm tweaking stuff less than plus or minus 1 dB. Based, I use the top of loudness range option. That seems to work really well for me.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I'll tweak less than a dB in either direction, usually post analog capture, but sometimes before, depending on what I want it to do.
It gets it very close, and I think that top of loudness range is unique to WaveLab. I've never seen it in another program.
I haven't seen that anywhere else.
It's basically like maximum short-term LUFS, but there's some other intelligence built in that makes it a little more musical and natural to the ear, I think.
Yeah, there's I think some gating that's done in the LRA loudness range calculation, which is I think a very misunderstood. I mean, that's a totally separate rabbit hole, but that metric, it's not, it's a lot of people think of it like dynamic range. It's really not. It's not like a DR or crest factor measurement. It's kind of its own thing. But yeah, it's a more intelligent way of thinking about the kind of range of natural macro dynamics, or like what a musician would think of as dynamics in a song. And so that does work very well. But just to quickly touch on the broadcast thing, like what you could do, you could have, so different streaming platforms, whether it's Netflix or Amazon or whatever, they all have their own specs of where they want loudness. I think there's starting to be some convergence there, but there's still some differences. So you could have a batch processor for each of those, and then you could assign those to a watch folder. You can have multiple batch processors assigned to a watch folder. And then so you could just drop your program into that watch folder when you're done, and it's going to give you, in subfolders, the program for each specific.
Yeah, so you could say, here's what I think sounds great, in my studio, and now I'm going to drop it in a folder, and it's going to normalize it so that it makes Netflix happy and Amazon happy and everybody. With music, we don't want to do that so much, but with broadcast and dialogue, it's you're already so far below. You're not really doing any heavy peak limiting. That those level changes are usually just actually static gain changes and not necessarily like easing up on any dynamics processing. It's more about just level changes.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you've showed us the resampler. Can you show us some other plugins that we can put in? I mean, you can do the plugins that come with WaveLab. You can do third-party plugins. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So just real quick, this is finished. So you'll see now the file list is empty, right? So if I go into my instrumentals here, there's a folder that says 96K, and it's got, all those files with underscore 96K at the end. And, you can see the sample rate, 32 float, everything kind of came out as we expected there.
Yeah, so now you're ready to master these in one cohesive 96K montage instead of having a mixture of sample rates and all sorts of stuff.
Right, exactly. And it's done it for, so for this project, I got main mixes, instrumentals, and acapellas, and it's done it for all of them just by dropping that one folder in. And I believe if I had set this to all audio file types before I dropped it in, it would have auto started. It might only do that when you drop a file and not a folder. Right. I don't usually drop folders, and I usually, I just go into my archival masters folder and then grab the individual files. But
well, that was a goofy one. I usually get stuff in as WAV, but every once in a while, people will send AIFF, and
yeah, exactly.
Just got to watch out. And I had one other thought, but let's talk about the other plugins that we can add, and I'll come back.
Yeah. So basically, you can add any plugin that you have, right? So whether it's one from Steinberg, I've got mine sorted into folders kind of by what they do, right? But you could add master rig in here. There for a second. Right, you could add master rig and set that up to do a specific thing. You could add your favorite EQ or multiband. I think I showed you in my production master one. I use God, I'm just looking for it. Where is it? I use Good Dither by Goodhertz for my dither, which is kind of cool because it actually has a bit scope built in, which I really like. So you can kind of see that. I don't remember where that's sorted in here. But yeah, so any of your normal, they call it master section plugins, but it's really things that could go in either track or clip effects too. All of those show up here. Then they've got what are called monopass plugins. And so these are things that basically they're not necessarily unique to the batch processor. You can use some of them in the audio editor tab as well. But basically it just processes the file as it goes through, right? So like there's an audio mixer, which is kind of interesting, right? So you could say, like if you want to watermark something, I don't do that, but I know some people like to.
Yeah.
You could have your little watermark file here, say put it in at 15 seconds and repeat it, every, I don't
Oh,
know,
wow.
45 seconds or whatever.
That's
And it's
huge.
going to, yeah. And so now it's going to go and it's going to mix that file in every 45 seconds with a 15 minute, 15-second offset, right? So there's stuff like that. There's a whole bunch of things, pitch correction, fade ins, if you want to just put a little fade on the beginning of everything. So a whole bunch of stuff in monopass. Then you've got multipass. And so what the multipass plugins are basically a plugin that needs to do some analysis first, right? So DC remover or loudness normalization, or fade out. If you want to fade out, it needs to know where the end of that file is and how to set the offset and what to do for the fade out. So pan normalizer, right? If there's a little imbalance in left right, it's got to analyze it first to figure out what that is. So multipass plugins do do an analysis pass and then a processing pass. You can actually set some of them up so that they'll do like iterative passes. So they'll do an analysis, do a process, check it, make sure it got it right, and then kind of hone in on what the right value is if you want. And then finally, there are these metapass plugins. So you've got a meta leveler and a loudness meta normalizer, which are similar to like the meta normalizer in the montage, but a little unique. And basically what the metapass plugins do are they look at all the files that you've dropped in. So, let's add this one in real quick. Right. So you can say match loudest audio file or match maximum achievable loudness. So maybe, the loudest audio file has 2 dB of headroom. And so it's going to turn that one up, and then it's going to figure out how much it has to turn up all the other files to match that loudness. You can say match specific loudness. But if you say match loudest audio file, right? So first it has to go through all the files and figure out which one the loudest one is. Right. So it does that. And then it goes through and it's going to do the actual normalization part. So metapass basically just means that it looks at all of the files and then goes back through and processes one at a time. So yeah, lot of processing options in there to take advantage of.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is so powerful. There is one question, and maybe you can help me. Maybe I'm not understanding it correctly. It just says, is there a way to put in, I think he means metadata tags for each file within one montage? And, my understanding is yes, because that's basically what I do. I have a metadata preset that, when I render each track or file or song from the montage, it takes data from within the montage. Like it knows that it's track 6 of 7. It basically takes the CD text name and transposes it to the song title of metadata and things like that. So if that's the question, I think that's what he's asking. Yes, it's very easy to do that because you can just, you have to set it up, but once you set it up the first time, it's pretty automatic. And then, you can even add artwork. So if you haven't seen any of the previous videos, there's definitely a way to do metadata in the montage and then make it so any files that you render automatically have it, which is a big time saver.
Yeah, and if there is in the format tab here, right? There is And actually, we should look a little bit more at this because there's multi-format too, which I showed briefly in my 44.1K batch processor.
Yeah, but let's see let's see how you set that up.
Yeah, but this is really powerful. But there are metadata options in here too. So if you wanted to add something specific to when you were running, like you want to add the time that the batch processor was run as a tag in there, you could do that potentially. But yeah, multi-format is really powerful. So basically you just click on the plus up here to, add a format. So let's just say Wave 16-bit, as one of them, right? And then you can create a subfolder right here. So you could say, 16-bit. And if you had, imagine you were resampling to 1644, you can even set up a suffix for that file that'll get stuck on the end and call, you can call that 1644 wave or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. So you can do that. So that's one format. And then you can say, oh, I want an MP3. Let's put that in a subfolder called MP3. And let's call it, 320K MP3. And you can really, the sky's kind of the limit here. You can add a whole bunch and do multiple formats at once, and they'll all get put in their, the subfolder that you want with a suffix. There's also, if you do, it's not in this window. I'm struggling to remember where it is, but there's a naming scheme window that you can access. And actually part of the naming scheme too is you can specify subfolders right within a naming scheme. So that's another way to get at kind of similar functionality. So that's really powerful too. The one kind of caveat with a multi-audio file format is that you kind of want them to all at least be starting with the same sample rate. I need to test this. I haven't tested it. It's possible that if you started with a high-res sample rate file and then specified 1644 in here, right? If you said 16-bit and you said that you want to be 44.1, it may very well, oops, don't want to save that necessarily. It may very well just use the resampler to do that. I haven't specifically tested that, so I can't say for sure.
Yeah, I'd like to have a little more control because, with the resampler plugin that you have, you could choose the quality, you can choose best, right. Which is typically what you want. I also haven't found a way to specify what settings it's using. But for those that haven't kept up, I think since WaveLab 9, it uses the SOX algorithm for sample rate conversion, which is considered one of the best. I don't know if you know much about it, Ian, if you can expand on.
I don't know a lot about the specifics of it. I know if you get into, so I think SOX maybe started as like a command line resampler tool, and there are ways to specify the filter roll off and frequency shift and all that stuff in there if you kind of get into the nerdy command line part of it.
Right.
I haven't dug into that. Suffice to say, yeah, it has an incredibly low noise floor and will allow like really no aliasing through. So it's a very clean resampler. Things like Sericon or the Isotope RX resampler do give you some kind of fine-grained control that's very user accessible, and they both have ways of resampling. Like, I don't know, I'm not an expert on how Sericon works, but my understanding of part of what makes it preferable in some cases is that it has very, very little pre-ringing. So most resampling algorithms use a linear phase filter. Linear phase has pre-ringing associated with it. That said, it's up at, if you're resampling to 44.1, it's at 22.025 kilohertz. So whether or not anyone can really hear that is another matter. But Sericon has a way of doing it by, the way their filter is designed that really keeps that pre-ringing very minimized. And the kind of trade-off is that it allows a tiny bit of aliasing above 20 kilohertz. So by allowing a little bit through up really way high in, like dog and bat and infants under, 18-month territory, you can really minimize the ringing. And so there are ways of tweaking resampling algorithms to kind of get slightly different results. And I don't know that there's a way to do that, natively with the resampler that's built in. That said, the SOX algorithm is excellent. And basically I used to do all my resampling in RX, and I had a whole bunch of presets that I would use for different applications. And at one point I said, okay, it's time to just sit down and do a whole bunch of ABX testing and blind shootouts. And I went through it, and there were a few where I thought, okay, maybe there's a tiny perceptual difference. Is anyone else ever going to notice? And is it worth the amount of time that I would spend doing that and going outside of WaveLab for every project? And for me, the answer was no.
Yeah.
That,
So I guess yeah, go ahead.
Most people are never going to notice that. And B, it's just, it takes a lot of time for a really, really teeny difference, which may or may not be preferable, right? Because that's the other thing. You have to say, okay, maybe there's a tiny perceptual difference, but which one is preferable? And so for me, I kind of went, you know what? SOX performs great. It's incredibly clean. It's not, it's really not adding anything or allowing any aliasing through. And that's the big thing that, I'm worried about with most resamplers is there aliasing? Is the noise floor being brought up? So for me, the answer was, this works great. It's incredibly clean.
Yeah. So
it simplifies my life.
Yeah. So the bottom line is the SOX resampler, starting with, I believe, WaveLab 9 is very good. Prior to 9, it was called the Crystal resampler. And I'll just say the SOX one is a huge improvement and considered, like, as you mentioned, up there with all the best ones. So I think for those that want to stay all inside WaveLab, it's a great. It's not, you shouldn't lose any sleep over using it. It's just it's a great resampler. I'm glad that it was added a while back now, but I just wanted to point it out because I think I've seen some users that still think they're using, the Crystal resampler, and that's been retired for a while now. So.
Yeah, and honestly, it was kind of doing that test for me that kind of made me go, okay, I really can stay 100% inside of WaveLab for a project now, right?
Yeah.
From ingest to final parts creation, between being able to build that into a batch processor and everything else, it's it's the only application I have to open and
Great.
work in.
And I'm getting a little lost now because we've added stuff in your normal resampler for your final output. Are you adding a dither plugin?
Yeah. So
after the resampler, because that's definitely best practice. Because as we talked about, any digital processing is going to increase the bit depth. So you always want to dither last after no changes are made, and that includes sample rate changes. That includes any gain changes, any fades. So it's the absolute last thing would be the dither.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, here's that. Sorry, my chair is very squeaky. I don't know if you guys are hearing that. My 44.1 production master batch processor, right? So I resample. I have that safety true peak limiter just at -0.3, just in case, and then my dither down to 16 bits.
Okay.
And actually, this is what I was kind of mentioning before. There is this bit scope built in here, which is also very handy to have. But yeah, WaveLab does have one. I've got it set up, so it's up kind of on the sidebar here. I can always get to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, cool. And you can have more than one batch processor open. So do you run them at the same time?
I usually don't.
Okay.
Honestly, you probably could, but yeah, usually I'll here, just close these. Normally I would have, right, like my montage open. I would have finished it. I would say, I'm going to say select multiple, and I'm going to grab, these two batch processors, and I'll open them. And then I would just go into my, production masters like in here, production masters, I haven't gotten here yet, but it'd be an archival. There would be a bunch of files here, and I just grab them, drop them into this one, check stuff on my phone. I mean, honestly, for, we did, God, I think this project has 16 songs times, 3 for main mixes, instrumentals, and acapellas. And it got through it in, I don't know, a minute or two. So it works pretty quickly.
Okay.
So I'll drop them in here, do that one, then pop over here, drop them in here, and everything will populate. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, you've definitely
on my way.
You've definitely inspired me to dig deeper into the batch processor. It's just one of those things where it's always a time thing. I'm like, oh, I should figure that out. And it's like, oh, I got this huge list of stuff that has to get done. And I just keep not avoiding it, but it's just like, it hasn't, but now I'm getting light bulbs are going off of how I could use it in my workflow. And again, stay right in WaveLab.
And I think, when you initially open it, right, it's like, okay, there's plugin chain, there's this, and there's just all these tabs down here. But really, like, a lot of it is pretty approachable. And you could set up a batch processor to do, if you're just looking to do some basic things, resampling, dithering, whatever, you can set that up in a matter of minutes. And then that's going to save you time every time you need to go and do that task.
Yeah. Did you say that you have some sort of setup that takes, because you have your clients upload files through Dropbox file request, right?
Yeah. So I'm not currently doing this, but honestly, this was as I was thinking through things last night that we could kind of talk about. I was like, you know what, maybe I should do this. So let's see. Let's show the watch folder tab here. So what you could do is, and I'm not going to do this live because I don't want it to go and start processing stuff that's in my file request folder, but you could create a watch folder, which basically all a watch folder is a folder that you specify somewhere on your computer.
So it's an existing folder and you're just telling WaveLab to watch it.
Yeah. You're just like, hey, keep an eye on this. And if anything new pops up in it, run this batch processor. Right. So, let's actually maybe just like make a new one on the desktop or something.
There you go.
Right. So we'll say, test watch folder. Right. So we can select that one. And then I'm going to say all audio files. And then you basically just select one of your batch processors. And this just looks in your default batch processor directory. So you would want to go and create one. You can create a new batch processor right from here, like if you just want to do it all at once. But personally, I would want to create the batch processor and test it and make sure it's doing everything the way I want. Right. But you could say, okay, I'm going to use my 96K ingest batch processor. Okay. And now you've got this watch folder set up. And there are a few options. So this is a little option window. You can, once it processes a file, you can just say, move the input file to the sources subfolder. For me, that's probably preferable. If someone's sending me their mix, I don't want to then go delete it. But if you're doing something that, whether it's your own stuff where you're not worried about retaining that original file or whatever the case may be, you can just delete the input files. If there's something that can't be processed, you can put it in errors subfolder. You can schedule it. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, right? So like if you say, I know, hey, I cut out of the studio at 5:30 and I'm not back in until, 8 a.m. You could just say, okay, run from 5:30 to, PM to 8 a.m. And that way it's just going to do this in the background. But then when you're in the studio, if someone, sends you a new file, it comes in during the day, you don't have to worry about it eating up any resources whatsoever. So that's and you can actually have two windows, right? So you can say from this time to that time and this time to that time.
Yeah.
So you can schedule it. You can get notifications when it's done, which, on a Mac is just a little thing that will pop up over here. You can add a README file, which is basically just a summary of what that watch folder is doing, where it's pointing. And then some advanced stuff, like how frequently do you look for new files? 5 times a second or, every minute.
And right? This is a potentially dumb question, but do we know if WaveLab has to stay open or can it do it?
That's an excellent question. So there are two ways to handle that actually. So I'm just gonna leave this kind of as it is. There's a little verify configuration, but when you go and you hit run, you get another. Okay. Well, so I've got the loudest meta normalizer.
It's not compatible with
Not
this.
compatible. Yeah. So there's certain things that aren't compatible with watch folders. So I'm going to remove that stuff and resave it. Okay. So when you go to hit start, you get two options. You can say start in this WaveLab Pro session, which is like the one that's open here, or you can say start as a background application. And if you do that, it actually opens a separate instance of WaveLab Pro that will just always run in the background to keep an eye on that folder. So you don't have to have your main instance open that you're necessarily working in. And then you can assign a priority to it, which is, basically just how demanding it's going to be on resources and other things. So I don't know, say normal. The other thing you can do is say activate watch folders at computer startup. So basically what this is telling you is next time I have to restart my computer, there's going to be a separate instance of WaveLab Pro that opens in the background and runs the watch folders. I'm going to leave that disabled, but if I now activate this, so it says come back. A separate WaveLab Pro folder is now running in the background. You can control it from the WaveLab Pro watch folder item in the menu bar. So I don't know if you guys are going to see this because of how I've done my screen sharing, but basically in the menu bar up here, you'll get a little WaveLab Pro icon.
Yeah, I don't think we're getting it, but it's basically up there by the time and if you have Dropbox or
all those little icons. And there's just, so it's just like a little eye for it's watching things, and you can click on that and either pause it or cancel it or close it or whatever.
Awesome.
Yeah. So now that's just going in the background. And if I were, let's see, can we just do this from the file browser? Trying to do this so you guys can see it. Can I get to my desktop from here? Might not be able to. Desktop, there we go. What do we call it? Test watch folder. So let's see, how can I do this?
Can you just paste some files in there from your Mac Finder?
Yeah, I'm trying to, let me see, maybe if I add this, here we go. So now I can go in here. I'm going to go grab some of these, and let's see if I just, is this going to allow me to, no.
You may have to do it outside of WaveLab.
Yeah. Well, here, I'll tell you what, we'll keep that window open, and I'm going to flip over to my desktop for just a second. And
so you're kind of simulating what's going to happen if someone uploads files to you through your website portal.
Right, exactly. Yeah. If this were that file request folder. So let me just grab a couple files here. Copy them and put them.
And for those that aren't that busy, this may not seem like too much of a big deal, but I think any busy mastering engineer or any busy audio library person is going to tell you that stuff like this just shaves hours off their days and weeks and months. And I also like stuff like this for consistency, because now you know that every time you upsample or resample a file, it has this suffix on the file name, and you know that what it is exactly.
Right. And so I don't know if you saw for a moment there was a little folder that just said, $temp, $. So that was stuff that was, kind of background files that I was working on. And so now I dropped 3 files in there, it's put, the originals in that sources folder. And it's put, I forgot we added the multi format to that batch processor, right? So it's given us 96K
MP3s.
as both MP3 and 16-bit. So
well, it handles everything.
Well, you know what? This is interesting. I'll check these later because now, right, part of this format, I did ask it to go back down to maybe I didn't explicitly say 44.1, so it has stayed at 96K. Anyway, I kind of rushed through that a little bit, so maybe not actually the ideal way to really process these things, but kind of gives you an idea of what's possible.
Pretty much anything is possible, it seems like. So
yeah.
Well, that's a cool thing. Watch folders are another thing that I've been meaning to, investigate more, but I'm not quite sure if my workflow, requires it, but I'm certainly getting ideas.
Yeah. And, so I played with them for a while, and I think the challenge for me, and the reason I've kind of shied away from them a little bit, is that I have a project directory that I set up for every project, and that process is automated too. So it creates all the subfolders that I want and moves the source files into the right folder and yada, yada. And so when I do my render out of a montage, one of the things that I use all the time is I'll use this set source folder, and then I go set source folder, and then I'll use text snippets and say, masters, production masters, archival, and I'll just stick that on the end so it goes exactly into the folder that I want it to. And so I like that those files just end up there, and then I'll go into that archival master folder up in the file browser, drag it into my batch processors, and all the subfolders just end up exactly where I want them. And so with watch folders, it spits out the files within that watch folder. There might be a way with that explicit directory option in the batch processor to specifically put it in, like, just in your top level mastering projects folder, but it doesn't have a way of processing the files and then putting them back basically where they came from. And so for me, I stayed away from that. But if you don't mind just dragging those files, you could not have to use, so I've got two batch processors, right? One for 44.1 and one for high res 24-bit. You could assign both of those batch processors to a watch folder, render right to that watch folder, and then you have all your files, and you just have to move maybe one folder.
Yeah, then you just put them where they go. No, that makes sense.
Really
There's
a big deal.
A lot of flexibility there.
Yeah.
Is there anything we didn't touch on in the batch processor? Otherwise, I think we're at a good point to see if there's any questions from anyone watching, or if you don't want to tell us any final points or anything we overlooked.
Yeah. I don't, not that I can think of. I think talking about the watch folders a little bit was kind of like the last thing I wanted to touch on.
Well, I appreciate you taking time out of your day to show us this, because I just knew that you had a lot of experience in here already and had some good ideas about how to do things and why to do things, and have explored basically every option within the batch processor. And it's kind of nice to have someone on to go back and forth with on these sometimes, instead of me just talking and wondering if the stream is still working. So this has been great to have you on. I'm not seeing any other questions pop up, but if anyone's watching this later, there is a WaveLab users group on Facebook, and I'm on there all the time. Ian is usually in there being helpful. So if you're watching this video later, just search for the WaveLab users group on Facebook. You can ask us questions in there. I try to monitor the the comments on these videos after the fact, but the WaveLab Facebook group is the best place. And, the WaveLab has an official forum on the Steinberg website, and the person that created and still develops WaveLab is also active there, so he can usually answer you as well. So you get answers right from the source of the person that made it. So it doesn't really get much better than that. But I think we're going to call it a day here and wrap up the video. But thanks again for your time.
Awesome.
And, I really appreciate having you on, and maybe we can do another one sometime, after some time has passed and there's some new things to talk about.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure.
All right. Well, have a good afternoon, and we'll talk soon.
Great. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.